G'day everyone, welcome back to the channel. So in today's video, I want to show you guys how to solve a tight or tender piriformis muscle. So for those who don't know, the piriformis muscle obviously resides in your glutes. It's one of your butt cheek muscles. It's essentially, if you can imagine where your back pocket would be in a pair of pants, that piriformis muscle is generally in that area, sort of in the centerpiece or the heart of that gluteal area. And it's really important because clinically, we see a lot when you're massaging someone or that you're trying to sort of solve someone's knee pain or hip pain or back pain. We often see that one piriformis or both piriformis muscles are either really tight and or tender, or at the very least, if both are tight and tender, one feels a little bit more so than the other. Now, I think it's a good conversation to have because we're really good at giving you things to do to free up and improve how that feels. And we'll go through two really simple ones today. But I guess the main purpose of this video is that I want to show you guys what to do after that to make sure that it goes away and that it doesn't come back again and that it doesn't become tight or tender again. So if you can hang around to the end of the video, you'll hopefully see a really interesting idea as to what the cause of that piriformis dysfunction often is, and then a really simple way to try and go about sort of rectifying that long term. So before we get into it, obviously, if you go on to enjoy the video, please consider leaving a like below and also consider subscribing if you do enjoy this kind of content. If you like trying to understand why the things happen to your body and then how to solve them, then hang around, follow the channel, and hopefully get some great information going forwards. And as always, let me know in the comments below. Let me know how those glutes are feeling. Have you had piriformis issues for a while? What's worked for you, what hasn't worked for you? Just let me know so we can sort of get an understanding of who's watching these videos. Now, getting straight into it. So the two really simple ways I've found to free up a tight and tender piriformis muscle. The first one involves using a ball. It's really simple, it's not very interesting. This is a lacrosse ball. Obviously you can use a tennis ball, a baseball, a golf ball if you want to. I wouldn't necessarily recommend using a foam roller, often because it doesn't really fit that area very well. So because you've got the hip bone and your pelvis and your sacroiliac joint around that area, sometimes a foam roller can be a little bit too broad, a bit too meaty, and you might need something a little bit smaller and more spherical to get in there and free it up. So basically what we want to do, again, when we're looking at that back pocket area, we want to basically put the ball in that area. And a really great way to do this is you can just lie down on the ball. Hopefully you can see this in the video. You just want to lie down and let the ball press in. Now, if it's very tender, it won't be very hard for you to find. If it's not tender, we still want to go looking for some tightness in the back sort of section of those glutes. So we're not necessarily on the side of the hip, which are more your adductors, the ones that we tend to strengthen more often. We're sort of more right on the back of the butt cheek, in the middle, and you should feel very easily that there'll be something that feels tight. Now, if this is comfortable for you, the first thing you can do is just let the ball press in, let it sink in, let that sort of trigger point of those tight restricted tissues give. If you need to ramp it up a little bit more, what you can do obviously is you can sit up a little bit more. Again, you can find that tightness and stay there. What I always like to advise people to do is we can create more tension in that piriformis muscle by rotating the hip. So by externally rotating the hip and then putting some pressure through the ball, you should find that you can expose maybe the nastiest version of that, which for some people can be very sore, so obviously be very gentle. But what I'll get people to do is if you find a spot that feels very tight and tender, we want to make sure that you can breathe your way through it. So if you take a deep breath in, and then if you just sigh on the way out, then you should find that the ball sort of sinks in a little bit further. You can tolerate that tenderness more often. So if you can keep repeating that deep breathing cycle, then very quickly this can give and feel a little bit better. Now, to ramp this up further, we always suggest using movement to free this up. So if you've got some pressure on the ball, and again, I'm not sure how well you can see this in the video, but we get some pressure on the ball right in the heart of that glute, and you can roll up and down and roll from side to side if you want to, but it often helps to include movement. So what we want to try and do here is, much like we crossed your leg over and sort of sat on top of the ball here, what we can do is we can create some rotation through the hip in both directions to shear free some of that tightness. So if there's some fascial restrictions, there's some form of adhesions or other restrictions in the area beyond muscular tightness, then this would be a really good way to free that up. So you have some pressure on it and you can rotate your leg in and out to really shear free some of that tightness. If you flex the hip and then rotate it, you'll definitely get a little bit more of an intense expression of that movement. but in a short amount of time, it should start to free up, particularly if you are deep breathing at the same time. So if you don't mind looking ridiculous for a little bit, it's a really good way to feed a lot more slack into that piriformis area and free that tissue up. So that's number one. That's a really specific way to get at the exact areas that feel tight and tender for you. Another great way to do this is with the pigeon stretch. So again, you can do this on the floor if you're flexible enough, if you're comfortable enough. If not, you might need to do it on a table or a chair or a bed or whatever it is. But essentially you want to place your shin and rest it on a surface. So for me, I'll do this on the ground here. So you want to place your foot on the ground, let that shin drop down. So again, you're creating that external rotation, and you want to just hunt around until you find some of that tightness in the hip. So in this sort of back pocket of the hip. So for me, sometimes I need to sort of pull my hips back a little bit to feel it. Sometimes I might need to twist a little bit more towards my knee or twist a little bit further towards my foot, just to figure out which part of which angle gives me the best access to that tightness. So as we always do on the channel, once you find some tightness, so I found a little bit of tightness here, what we want to get you to do is tense up that tightness. So give that piriformis a good squeeze, hold it for about 5 seconds, and then release that tension. So don't come out of the stretch, just find the tightness, give it a squeeze for a few seconds, hold it, stop squeezing while maintaining the position. And then when you relax, you should find you can actually go a little bit deeper into the stretch than what you could before. So for me, I can get to here now, give it a good squeeze again, hold it for a few seconds, and relax. And then again, I can drop down further again, good squeeze for a few seconds, and then relax. And then again, I can drop down further again. So again, imagine that I'm doing this on a chair or a bed if it's easier for you. But the purpose is you want to create that external rotation with your hip bent up a little bit to really open up that tightness at the back. And by tensing those tight muscles for a period of time, you're actually getting your brain involved. You're not just treating your muscles like a piece of meat. It's this complicated sort of neuromuscular system. So by getting that brain involved, you can promote optimal relaxation of that tissue really quickly. So hopefully you can see in the video, if you rewind it a few seconds, that as I sort of tensed it and relaxed it, I could actually drop down deeper. And after doing that, my hip actually feels a hell of a lot looser than what it did beforehand, just from using a ball of some sort and relaxing that tissue into submission and allowing that to free up. So the tenderness or any tenderness or tightness that was there should immediately be less so. And it may not be perfect straight away, depending on how quickly or how long you've had this for, but you should see some instant changes with those two techniques. And as we said at the start of the video, in a perfect world, you'd also be doing something to stop that from reoccurring again. So what we want to transition into is, I think, something that isn't necessarily as well known as it could be in the industry, and also more so from a broader medical industry, and also everyday people sort of living their lives, that a lot of piriformis dysfunction is actually a consequence of low back dysfunction. So you don't necessarily have to have a sore back. You don't necessarily have to have any form of back pain or overt dysfunction day to day. But if there's some stiff and tight sections of your back, the nerves that come from those areas tend to go through or very close to that piriformis muscle. There's a bunch of other nerves that supply that piriformis muscle. So if there's some dysfunction higher up in the spine, so it's sort of the base of the spine, or that thoracolumbar junction where your ribcage meets your lower back, from there down, if there's some stiffness and some tightness in that area, you can ask that piriformis to tighten to help support that dysfunction. So again, if you're doing all this fantastic stretching, if you're using a ball, if you're getting a massage, if you're doing all this glute strengthening work, you're having physical therapy, whatever it is to free up that piriformis muscle, then there's every chance it's going to keep coming back again day after day unless you take a step back and figure out what's going on with your back at the same time. Now, we see this a lot. So this idea isn't necessarily too foreign for a lot of people who do have back pain. There's a thing called piriformis syndrome, which is essentially linked to sciatica, low back dysfunction, but we often sort of tend to silo these pieces of information and say, well, if you have back pain, it's understandable that you have some piriformis issues. But if you have piriformis issues, even if they're not overt ones, you just feel tender and tight all the time, we don't often connect the dots and say, well, look, it's actually still a back issue. It's just that there's no back irritation there. And you don't have to have that to have that piriformis dysfunction. So we want to make sure that we give you something to free up that back, to restore some normality to that spine, so that all the hard work that you're doing to mobilize and free up and settle down that piriformis isn't wasted and you don't have to keep doing it forever, that you have mastered that, you freed it up, but you also turn the tap off as well. So the water that flows down to cause that is now shut off, and you can be free of it and then move on to something more important. So a great way to do it. You can use a foam roller for this, but again, I'll use a ball just because we've got one handy. The areas that we want to go hunting through, again, it can be right down the base of your back, but I find a lot of it tends to happen at the base of the rib cage and the top sections of the lower back through here. So for a lot of women, it's almost a hand's width down from your bra line. For most guys, it's almost a hand's width up from your pant line or your belt line. And what we want to do with the ball, it's the same thing with the foam roller. If I choose, say this section here, the foam roller would obviously go straight across. But for this instance, we want to start in the middle and then let it roll off to one side, whichever side you feel is most important. So for me, I'll do this side. And same thing again, we just want to lie down on the ball. I think you can just see it there. And we want to go looking for some tightness and stiffness, the same thing that we did with the piriformis, when we did the piriformis. But this time, we're not just looking for muscular tightness, we're also trying to get a sense of how stiff those underlying spinal joints are. And what I can almost recommend and almost guarantee that you'll find is that if you go hunting in this area, so for me, it feels a little bit stiff and tight on this left-hand side, so the same side that I was a little bit tender here. When I come across to the exact same spot, so if you're right on the bump of the spine, roll off to one side, just directly off, get a sense of how that feels, come back to the other side and compare the two. Generally, you want to spend the most time on the side that feels the stiffest and the tightest, or the hardest to press into. So for me, there's a fraction of some tightness and some tenderness on this right-hand side. But when I come across to the left-hand side, there's no tenderness, but it feels like there's a lot more sort of rustiness and restricted tissue there. It's harder for that ball to sink in, even though there's no overt tenderness to speak of. This is what we're looking for. We're looking for restrictions in that spine that are asking your glutes or that piriformis muscle to reactively tighten and become dysfunctionally tender as a consequence. So again, we just want to stay here, find a spot that feels tight. We're not rolling up and down. We want to move the ball until we feel something that feels restricted. We want to use some breathing to allow that to free up quickly. And we're just staying here for a period of time. So we're not necessarily, as I said, rolling around. We're not doing anything fancy. We're just letting the ball consistently press into different sections of the spine to free those up and restore normal motion to those joints. And you can do that for as long as you feel comfortable. But from what we find clinically, there's a really strong connection between those stiff spots, which you'll probably find, and that tightness in the hip. So if you can get rid of both of them, then you should feel like that piriformis tightness and tenderness doesn't return long term. So again, hopefully there was some interesting information there. The final thing that I'll leave you with is often the bookend of a lot of these videos. We also want to talk about why that section of your back may become stiff. I won't go into it in too much detail. We'll save it for another video, but the idea is that whichever level of your spine that you feel is the stiffest and the tightest, and whichever side of the spine feels stiff and tight, and you might find there's just one section that feels stiff where everything else around it's not too bad. There has to be a reason why that section of your spine has become dysfunctional in its own right. And what we see a lot clinically is it often comes back to the shapes and the positions that you put your back into. So again, for me, I've got a bit of an unnatural curve at sort of this section of my back, sort of through here. I don't know if you can see that very well. Sort of the sharpest point of the hinge is often the area that gets the stiffest and the tightest. So for me, I had the ball in this level, and that's often the level that I might sink through if I'm not paying attention. So again, if you want to rid yourself of some piriformis dysfunction, you've got to have a conversation about your postural habits, how straight your spine is generally from a postural sense. Again, obviously we're not talking about the spinal curve, we're just talking about a good postural, good expression of that anatomy. And you need some tools to be able to free up that piriformis specifically. So again, hopefully that was helpful. Let me know in the comments below what you're thinking, whether there's any extra information that you're looking for. And until next time, we'll see you then.